Jessica Delancy and her new man are hot for each other in sunny Jacksonville, Florida.
He brought excitement to her life.
But Jessica will pay the ultimate price for getting involved with a man who plays dirty.
She accepted the criminal activities as a way of life to keep up the financial rewards that came with it.
Jessica would do anything to help her man get what was rightfully his.
And later in the Windy City, Lisa Toney is starved for attention when she takes up with a sexy stranger.
He had this way of being able to zero in on a woman to get whatever it was that he wanted.
And she'll do anything to give her new man what he wants.
He was a fatal attraction.
Lisa was going to be his next victim.
For as long as she can remember, Jessica Delancy of Picketteville, Georgia, has only known what it's like to feel unwanted and alone.
She was abandoned by her mother. Jessica's father was abusive, and he was an alcoholic.
Jessica's grandmother is left to care for her, but pays little attention to her needs.
She had no home life whatsoever. There was no one there to help direct her.
There wasn't a lot of things in her environment that could reinforce her in a positive way.
Despite her circumstances, Jessica still holds out hope that one day she'll get far away from Picketteville.
Daydreaming is certainly a coping mechanism because she felt neglected and abandoned. And for Jessica, that daydream, that fantasy, the constant fantasy she had in her mind was to be wanted and to be loved.
Fresh out of high school, 17-year-old Jessica marries the first man who catches her eye. He whisks her away to Jacksonville, 10 miles down the road.
She's desperately looking for somebody to love and accept her. He didn't treat her very well. Not long after that, he left her with a son to take care of on her own.
A year after leaving home, Jessica is already looking for a fresh start. She and her son move in with a friend who works as an exotic dancer, and Jessica signs up for classes at the local community college.
She was trying to better herself by getting an education. She was going to school to be a certified nursing assistant, but she had some difficulties to pay for those education programs.
With her bills piling up, Jessica's new roommate suggests a way to fix her money problems.
She had no real way of making a living. Her friend told Jessica the fastest way you can make this cash is to come and work at the strip club.
Jessica takes her friend's advice and makes her way to the dance floor.
She worked as an exotic dancer at one of the local clubs here.
She was an attractive girl. She did very well financially. She walks away in the evening and has cash in her pocket that she can now spend freely.
Jessica drops out of school to focus full-time on making money at the club.
Jessica was like a lot of other young ladies who are simply looking to escape circumstances that are already dismal. They want to find a better life, but they don't have a real plan. They haven't really thought about the resources they have at hand or resources that are available to them.
But there are drawbacks that come with her new lifestyle that affect her now 2-year-old child.
Between taking care of her son and stripping, that was a very, very tough balancing act for her.
Jessica would oftentimes leave her son for long periods of time. When she was dancing, she relied heavily on other family members to assist her.
When she ended up having her own child at a very young age, she repeated that same behavior, what she was taught, to be neglectful and to abandon. And therefore she did the same to her child by passing the care of that child on to her family.
The last thing Jessica expects to find stripping is love. But that's exactly what happens when, a month into her new job, she spies 19-year-old drug dealer Derek Goldson.
Derek took a fancy to Jessica and they struck up conversation.
They exchanged phone numbers that night. And Jessica and Derek, from then on out, You know, they started a relationship.
And it isn't long before the only place Jessica wants to be is by the side of her new man.
Derek had large amounts of cash because of his involvement in the drug trade.
The combination of being a decent-looking guy and having substantially more money than she was ever earning as an exotic dancer, it was almost too much to resist.
Jessica doesn't care where the money comes from, as long as Derek is spending it on her.
He slipped a wad of cash in her G-string, and he made her feel good about herself.
It's really not surprising that she would date someone who had a very severe criminal occupation, a drug dealer, and he took care of her financially. This fed into that fantasy she always had of being taken care of in every way possible. So his lifestyle, for her, didn't even matter.
Just 5 days after meeting Derek, Jessica packs up her 4-year-old son and moves in with him. But she quickly learns that her new relationship comes at a price.
Not long after Jessica realized that he was a very controlling person. He told her that she had to stop working at the strip club. She's his woman. He doesn't want other men looking at her.
Derek promised to support her and her son, so she quit her job as a dancer.
Like I said, I'm taking care of you. I'm your daddy now. Does your father know?
By Derek offering to take care of Jessica, this was the beginning of a grooming that we see quite often happens. In many ways, this is what she wanted. The fantasy come true. The knight in shining armor riding in and taking care of her. But this was really a pure manipulation, a grooming by Derek.
Derek is not only a control freak, he's also a drug dealer who's addicted to his own product.
Whenever Derek would use cocaine, he would have a short temper and he would become very volatile. On multiple occasions, he would blacken her eye or bloody her lip.
She didn't try to get out of that situation because at that point, him taking care of her and her son, she probably saw it as a necessary evil.
By Jessica growing up in a home where her father was missing, the affection of a father, the role modeling of a father as to what a relationship should be, in this case between a man and a woman, Jessica didn't know what a healthy relationship was.
Despite Derek's abusive behavior, Jessica stays in the relationship, and within a few months, she finds herself in a new line of work.
Derek had Jessica working for him. She would frequently drive him to places to pick up drugs and to drop off drugs. The main person that Jessica and Derek dealt with was a guy by the name of Reggie.
Reggie acts as Derek's main supplier, and their business relationship seems to run smoothly, until the night that Reggie sells Derek a batch of bad crack cocaine.
Derek was cooking up the substance on the stove, and the product turned into mush. So he says, well, I can't go out and sell this. This turned into a $1,000 loss.
He became very irate. He was saying that he was going to go over and force Reggie to make this thing right.
I'm gonna get his ass. We're gonna get his ass.
As a drug dealer, your reputation is on the line. You have to do something extreme to make the person pay for it.
Derek will not rest until he can recoup his cash. He comes up with a plan to steal his money back from Reggie, and Jessica is eager to help him.
Jessica's looking at this as, we're going to do anything we need to do to get this money.
You with it?
Yeah, come on, of course.
She's saying, this is my man, and I'm going to do what I need to do to keep it all good with him.
The couple decides to disguise their appearance in order to take Reggie by surprise.
So at that point, they really take on this Bonnie and Clyde persona. Derek put on a black knit cap over his face, and Jessica donned a blonde wig.
Then they drive to Reggie's house, and while they wait outside for him to show up, Derek works out one last detail with Jessica.
Derek had a AK-47. He provided Jessica with a .45 caliber handgun.
This is a guy she's known for 4 months. He's now asking her to commit a crime.
She could have withdrawn at that point. She could have said, no, don't give me that gun. I don't want to do this.
Derek says, Jessica, this gun is for your protection. That's when it really becomes all real to Jessica. She takes the gun.
It's quite obvious that Jessica has the same mind frame at this point as Derek. She was willing to commit murder in order to please him, but to also let him know that she was an equal partner in their crime.
And when Reggie shows, Jessica continues to follow Derek's lead.
At that point, he was confronted by Derek and Jessica at gunpoint, and that he forced him inside of the house.
Once inside, they realize Reggie doesn't live alone. He has a family.
She realized that there's Reggie's wife and Kyoto.
And their niece, who was 10 years old. I think Jessica was extremely surprised to see anybody except perhaps Reggie's wife inside the house.
Where's the money? It's in the back, man.
Despite her shock, Jessica keeps her gun aimed at Reggie's family as she stands by her man ready to take his orders.
You would think that Jessica, being a mother herself, her motherly instincts would kick in, but apparently Derek's hold over Jessica was a lot more stronger.
After knowing 19-year-old Derek Goldson for just 4 months in Jacksonville, Florida, 21-year-old Jessica Delancy is ready to prove her love to him. After Derek's supplier Reggie sells him a bad batch of cocaine, Jessica joins Derek on a mission to steal back his money.
Derek and Jessica force Reggie into the home. She just instinctively followed Derek's lead.
Reggie's wife, Kyoto, and his 10-year-old niece are in the living room. Despite the presence of a child, Jessica and Derek demand that Reggie give them their money.
We just want the money. That's all we want.
Reggie indicated that the money was in the bedroom, in a closet. Jessica went to look for it while Derek kept Reggie and Kyoto in the living room.
While Jessica is searching for the drugs and money, she hears Derek cry out to her. When she runs back in, she sees a struggle ensuing between Reggie and Derek. They're fighting over the gun.
Derek is trying to give Jessica commands about what to do as he's wrestling with Reggie. Jessica manages to shoot Reggie once in the back.
As Reggie fell to the floor, Derek then took control of the rifle and then executed him.
Jessica and Derek are clearly working as a team. She's willing to do anything to fortify their relationship.
What do we do now?
I don't know.
While the killers are distracted, Kyoto tries to escape.
She turned and fired multiple shots at Kyoto as she was fleeing from that home.
Despite Jessica's attempt to shoot her, Kyoto manages to get away.
Derek and Jessica ran out the front door of the home and back to the truck. They knew at that point in time, based upon the screaming and the gunshots, the police were going to be on the way.
He ordered Jessica to grab the wheel and to drive, to actually be the getaway driver.
The pair start to flee the scene.
Derek begins to question Jessica about Kyoto, and he said, "Did you kill her?" And she said, "I don't know." At this point, she's flustered. She doesn't really know what happened, but she did shoot at her.
Suddenly, Derek spots something out of the corner of his eye.
Oh, yeah, there she is.
As they were pulling off, Derek saw someone hiding underneath a tree off to the left of the road.
He yelled at Jessica to stop. She slammed on the brakes.
Derek wants to make sure there are no loose ends.
Derek got out to confront Kyoto, who then begged for her life and asked him why he was doing this.
Derek raised up the AK-47, executed Kyoto.
At this point, you have Jessica, who sees her boyfriend murder 2 people. You would think that Jessica would be feeling like, my boyfriend is a lot more dangerous than I figured. I'm going to take off. But she didn't do that.
After she had witnessed Derek killing 2 people, there are a lot of things going on in her mind, but leaving him was not one of them.
Now partners in 2 cold-blooded murders, Jessica and Derek flee the scene. The money they came to get, forgotten.
The result of this entire affair is that it was all for naught. They took nothing except 2 lives. And that's a tragedy.
She could have opted to stop participating. For her, there was just no turning back.
For the next 3 weeks, Derek and Jessica hole up in their apartment, hoping everything will blow over.
Derek continued to tell her, well, you can't tell anybody about this.
Derek and Jessica believed that the only witnesses that could identify them were the 2 individuals that were killed. Jessica and Derek thought they got away with murder.
What they don't realize is that when they drove away from Reggie's apartment, a crucial witness emerged from her hiding spot.
And only a matter of feet away, sort of concealed under the tree in the bushes, was the niece.
She witnessed all of these things that happened.
It's difficult to imagine the impact on a 10-year-old child witnessing an execution, particularly of your aunt or a relative, but of anyone. That's an experience that's going to live with that young girl all of her life.
After running to a neighbor's house for safety, Reggie's niece calls the police.
She gave a very detailed description of the events from the very beginning to the end.
Reggie's niece tells the police the man was wearing a mask, but she's sure that she'd recognize the woman if she saw her again.
She had a very lucid and very excellent memory for the features, and it resulted in a very good sketch and likeness.
That just shows you that sometimes trauma can make people remember things. It stays in their mind, and it becomes very vivid to some people.
As investigators hunt for Jessica, Derek's pulled over in a traffic stop, and detectives run his plates. He's wanted on an outstanding warrant from a domestic dispute he had with a former girlfriend. He's immediately taken into custody.
Now at this point, the police don't know that Derek is the guy they're looking for. He calls Jessica and asks her to go to his best friend's Garrett house to get this bail money for him.
When Jessica arrives at Garrett's house to collect the money, she's unprepared for who she'll meet there.
Garrett was actually dating the sister of Kyoto Williams.
When she goes to the house, there are friends of Kyoto who are going to her funeral.
And one guest in particular catches Jessica by surprise, Reggie's niece. And later, in Chicago, Lisa Toney leaves her husband for another man, with explosive results.
She wanted him dead, and sooner the better.
He was like a shadow moving through the night. I mean, he could have walked up to him and blew his brains out, but he did not. He devised what he considered a perfect crime by sending him a package with a bomb in it.
Lisa would have her life turned upside down by a master of manipulation.
To prove her love to Derek, Jessica got a tattoo of him on her neck. Derek got a tattoo of Jessica on him as well, a binding kind of connection to each other, that they were going to be together forever.
Jessica Delancy and her boyfriend Derek Goldson believe they've gotten away with a double murder after they shot and killed their drug supplier Reggie and his wife Kyoto over a deal gone bad. But when Derek gets thrown in jail on an unrelated charge, their quest for money will be their undoing.
Derek calls up Jessica and tells her to go to his best friend Garrett's house to get the money that he needs.
Garrett was actually dating the sister of Kyoto Williams. Jessica went over. Garrett was getting ready to go to a memorial for Kyoto Williams.
You have all of these people here who were preparing to go to Kyoto's funeral. Among those, the 10-year-old niece who saw her aunt was murdered.
The niece ran out of the living room into one of the back bedrooms. Kyoto's sister ran after and asked her what was wrong, and the 10-year-old reported that's who killed Reggie and Kyoto.
Jessica and Derek thought they had gotten away with murder. They were riding high. They thought they were invincible until that point that a child stepped up to identify them. And at that point, she knew that it was all over.
Jessica immediately leaves the house without Derek's bail money. Reggie's niece is taken to the police, who learn about Jessica and the person who connects her to both Garrett and Kyoto.
The police then reviewed Derek Goldson's jail phone calls and realized that Derek Goldson had had a conversation with Jessica Delancy about this encounter with the 10-year-old niece. Based upon their investigation and hearing these phone calls that were made between Derek and Jessica, a warrant for her arrest was obtained from a judge.
Jessica is picked up at her home and taken into custody. Confronted with her own voice on tape, Jessica confesses to investigators.
Jessica not only confessed to her part in the murders, but she also revealed Derek's part in the murder as well.
Because Derek was in jail, Jessica no longer felt that she was under his thumb, under his rule, under his power, and therefore was much more comfortable in speaking to the police as to what had happened. At this point, she was going to look out for herself and without the fear of retribution from Derek.
In exchange for her testimony against Derek, Jessica is given a sentence of 48 years.
Derek pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed robbery. Based upon his plea agreement, he would be sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences.
And the irony of all of this is after Derek murdered Reginald, after he murdered his wife, they didn't get any money. They didn't find any money. So that was a wasted errand that ended with a lot of wasted lives.
Including Jessica's.
All of Jessica's dreams about freedom and being taken care of and having love in her life, they've all gone down the drain because of that fateful decision of getting involved with a man that she thought she loved.
You can always tell a person's future by the people they hang around with, and this guy was a drug dealer. She should have seen the writing on the wall.
I think that she began life as a very damaged woman, which made her more vulnerable to meeting someone like Derek Goldson, who promised her the world. That's the tragedy of the story.
Like Jessica Delancy, Chicagoan Lisa Toney also has a taste for the fast life. And she's willing to trade in the man she has for one who can give her what she wants. After 6 years of marriage to husband Marcus, Lisa Toney seems to have it all.
Lisa and Marcus lived in Dalton, Illinois together with her son from a previous marriage.
They appeared to be happy to the outside world. She was a good homemaker and a good mother.
Marcus really worked hard as a custodian, and when he did get any extra money, he used that for flipping properties.
But Lisa takes on the lion's share when it comes to growing the couple's fortunes.
For more than 20 years, Lisa worked for a major phone company, eventually becoming a human resources manager. Lisa made substantially more than Marcus. She had a 6-figure salary.
Over time, Lisa starts to feel the pressure of keeping her family afloat.
As the breadwinner, you've got a lot of responsibility and a lot of extra stress.
And it isn't just the salary gap weighing on Lisa.
While she loved her husband, Marcus really had a temper, and he would just lash out at her over the smallest things.
They had some very bad altercations. Marcus had some violent temper, and he would become abusive.
She was really conflicted about their relationship.
When a handsome stranger moves in across the street, Lisa becomes even more torn.
She was immediately taken by his appearance. He was muscular, well-dressed, well-spoken, educated, and he knew how to impress people.
She attracted this young man, handsome man. She just wanted to have a little fun.
Cienki Lalamond is a serial con artist with a history of targeting women. And Lisa is about to become tangled up in one of his schemes.
Lisa had her life turned upside down by a man who was a master manipulator.
Feeling stuck in a crumbling marriage with her husband, Marcus.
Marcus really had a temper, and he would just lash out at her over the smallest things. While she loved her husband, she just really could not take that treatment.
Lisa longs for the affection of a man who will treat her right.
She felt like, baby, she just wanted to have a little fun, wanted to change her lifestyle.
That opportunity comes knocking when a seductive stranger, Cienki Lalamond, moves into the neighborhood and introduces himself to Lisa.
Cienki was very smooth and suave. He had a kind of a sexual presence that would attract any woman.
He said that he was a financial consultant, and he started asking her, hey, how's your credit? She said, it's not very good, and he said, well, I can help you fix that.
He gave her his card and said, call me.
Lisa takes Cienki up on his offer, and it isn't long before she's revealing her personal problems that also need fixing. Cienki jumps at the chance to help Lisa take her mind off her troubled marriage.
He went through the courting process like any man would do. He wined and dined her and wooed her with gifts and flowers.
Their relationship kind of changed after a short while from someone she'd see in the neighborhood. There were romantic getaways.
She attracted this young man, handsome man, who was obviously very sexy.
To Lisa, Cienki is everything her husband is not. He's an attentive lover and flush with cash. And Marcus seems oblivious to Lisa's secret meetings with him.
Lisa was taken with this man's grand romantic gestures because this is something that she felt that she needed. But he wasn't doing it out of the kindness or generosity of his heart. He was doing it so that he can get her to do anything he wanted later on.
Cienki knows all the right moves to get Lisa to melt in the palm of his hands. But what looks like the start of a passionate affair is really just a con man's ploy to tee up his next score.
Cienki was a career criminal and quite often took advantage of women. That was his ploy, that was his game, that's what he was really good at. And he found the perfect victim in Lisa, because here was a woman who was having all sorts of marital issues and felt very unfulfilled in her marriage.
What Lisa doesn't know is that all this romance comes with a price.
He knew from the beginning that Lisa was basically going to be a huge gold mine. Marcus had a steady job. He did have good credit. He had property. He was the kind of person that credit card companies are eager to give credit to. Cienki took full advantage of that.
When he agreed to help her correct her credit, he also inquired about Marcus.
Well, he's a janitor.
He would ask Lisa stuff about my mother's maiden name and all that stuff, and Marcus' mother's maiden name, including his social security number.
Lisa gave him all of her financial information. She would basically do whatever it was that he asked. Cienki had this way of being able to zero in on a woman and be able to get that person to do whatever it was that he wanted.
With an all-access pass to Marcus's personal information, Cienki gets to work, taking over his identity.
Cienki was a master identity thief. He created a false driver's license with Marcus Toney's name on it and Cienki's picture.
Cienki opened up a P.O. box in a mailing facility in Marcus Toney's name. He could easily receive and be accessible to Marcus's mail without any questions being asked.
Cienki has already done all the work needed to prosper at Marcus's expense. When Lisa tells him she's had enough of her marriage and wants to start a new life with him, that's when Cienki lets Lisa in on his shady dealings.
She implied that she wanted to do something negative or harmful to Marcus. And Cienki explained to her, rather than physically harming him, it would be much better to steal from him.
When Cienki confesses to Lisa that he's already laid the groundwork to rob Marcus blind, she tells him that she wants in on the action.
Almost any woman involved in an affair who finds out that their boyfriend is trying to financially defraud their husband would be upset and want to get out of that as quickly as possible. But Lisa, surprisingly, went along with it.
She was in favor of that. She felt that this was her way of getting back at him. It was perfect combination of factors for her.
It went beyond just having some sex on the side to wanting to financially destroy her husband. She wanted to humiliate him.
Now that Lisa's in on the con, the sky's the limit. And for the next 6 months, the conniving couple goes on an all-out spending spree.
Marcus had at least 9 different credit cards opened in his name, charges soaring up to at least $200,000. Marcus was oblivious to the fraud. Lisa was going about everyday life as if nothing had happened.
She's never displayed any regrets about stealing from Marcus. She thought she was justified, that he deserved what was happening to him, and she deserved the good things that were coming from him.
Lisa was so deep into this extramarital affair with Cianci that she was oblivious to the fact that the debt that she was creating for her husband, the financial ruin she was creating for her husband, she would be responsible for at some point, because legally she'd have to help pay that off.
7 months into their spending spree, Lisa decides it's time to show Marcus the door.
Lisa threw him out. She told him, go live in one of your rental apartments and get out. She threatened him with divorce.
Marcus didn't want to go. He loved her and thought they could work out whatever the problems.
That's when Lisa tells him that she's already moved on.
Lisa was able to tell her husband about this infidelity because of the years of abuse she suffered at his hands. So in some ways, this might have been the final kiss-off, the revenge, by letting him know not only was she free of him, but she found someone who she felt was a much better person.
And when Marcus discovers the second part of his wife's betrayal, Lisa will stop at nothing to protect her new man.
Marcus was starting to become aware that maybe he and Lisa had something to do with this. They came up with a plan so they wouldn't get caught.
Delancy had a great amount of power over Lisa that caused Lisa to act the way she did.
And Marcus out of the house in Chicago. Lisa Toney is having the time of her life with con artist Cianci Lalamond. Lisa and her new man are living the high life, literally at Marcus's expense.
She had expensive jewelry, beautiful clothes, luxury hotel stays. This was not the life that she had been used to.
Lisa was getting everything from Cianci that she did not get from Marcus. All these things fit into her idea of what her lifestyle should be.
For Lisa to have gotten involved in that affair with Cianci, and to take it even a step further by wanting to hurt him financially, it speaks to perhaps her being abused by him for many years. She was very unhappy in her marriage, so this was a way to get some sort of revenge.
But Lisa and Cianci's life in the fast lane is about to come to a screeching halt when creditors catch up with Lisa's estranged husband, Marcus.
Marcus started getting all these calls from credit card companies, and he was having to dispute these charges, and he was just baffled as to why this was even happening to him.
Marcus had excellent credit before. He'd always paid his bills on time.
Marcus starts to wonder if he's deliberately being singled out, and he takes a guess at who might want to do him wrong.
He came to the house and saw 2 expensive cars parked in the driveway. Marcus became suspicious of Lisa.
And when he looked in, he saw Cianci was there along with Lisa.
He was able to tie in all the things that had been happening to him, including his credit problems.
Marcus realizes that not only has Cianci taken up with his wife, he's also taken off with his money.
Marcus began contacting Lisa and threatening her to go to the police. He figured out what was going on.
The prospect of bringing the police into the picture doesn't sit well with Lisa.
She panicked and started complaining to Cianci that we have to do something because we're going to get in trouble.
I just want to get rid of him. Like,
He wanted to kill him dead right then and there.
But Cienki is a master at the long game, and he has an explosive plan. He tells Lisa that he has a friend who can hook them up with exactly what they need to get the job done.
Cienki spent some time in a halfway house where he met another young man who had knowledge of how to make bombs. It was a standard pipe bomb. It had a pipe with 2 end caps with a hole drilled through that a wire could be placed in, and it was connected to a pull chain.
Cienki appears to be such a sadistic individual. Not only did he want Marcus's wife, but he also wanted to torture. He wanted to play with Marcus. He wanted to destroy Marcus. In many ways, psychologically, he had a predator mentality. And because he did it so well, he was reinforced to keep doing it over and over again.
While Cienki is busy getting his hands dirty, Lisa patiently waits across town for word that the job is done.
At the time, she was safely in a hotel room in the city. They were communicating with each other over the cell phone.
Cienki sets the plan in motion, and once he has his weapon, he packages it inside a VCR case and puts it in a box that's rigged to go off when opened. Next, he gift wraps the package before shipping it to Marcus's new home across town.
So whichever side of the package you would open, it would pull that chain and explode.
He devised what he considered a perfect crime.
The next day, Marcus receives this special delivery. When he opens it up a little, he sees the VCR case. And Marcus thinks that the package contains another betrayal from his wife.
Marcus knew Lisa was sexually involved with Cienki, and he initially thought that there was going to be a videotape of Cienki with Lisa in his VCR. He still loved her and did not want to be confronted with her being physically involved with this character. So he didn't want to open the package initially. He put the package on the side.
But a few days later, Marcus decides to bring the box to the police.
He was torn because he knew she was being defrauded. He wanted that to stop. He really didn't want necessarily Lisa to go to jail. He wanted to get back with her.
He said, you know, I've been the subject of credit card fraud, and I think that this is someone trying to play some kind of prank with me.
The police dismiss Marcus's concerns and send him home with the package without examining its contents. And Marcus has no interest in finding out what's inside either, leaving Cienki to turn into a ticking time bomb of his own.
He's thinking he's gonna get word of a huge explosion any moment, but 8 days pass and he hears nothing.
Frustrated, Cienki decides to up the ante.
Cienki starts to call Marcus's house and leave these taunting messages.
So why don't you go ahead and open that little present?
He really attacked his manhood, and he said, "Open the box. Are you a coward?"
Cienki and Lisa were taunting Marcus to open that box and blow himself up. Tells me that these were people who were so deeply involved, so viscerally connected to one another, that they shared in the joy of hurting someone else.
Lisa had 8 days to warn Marcus about his potential doom, but she wanted him to die.
The menacing calls to Marcus finally pay off. 8 days after Cienki sends the package, Lisa finally gets the news she's been waiting for.
Lisa was watching the local news and she heard about an explosion at a South Side apartment, and then she sees a body bag being taken out of this apartment building, and the victim's name is Marcus Toney.
Lisa hurries home to Cienki, wondering what their next move should be. But instead of Cienki, she finds someone else waiting at her front door.
I'm just so shocked that I would do such a thing.
Cienki's gone.
Right after the murder, Cienki fled. He went to Jamaica. Who is he meeting there? A woman that he met from an online dating site.
Cienki spent time in jail for extortion.
he met a closeted gay man and videotaped the encounter. He then sends a demand letter. If you don't want anyone to find out about this, send me $16,000.
The wife became aware of the extortion and reported to the police about the extortion, and he was subsequently charged and sentenced to 18 months in prison.
After Marcus Toney is killed by a pipe bomb mailed to him by his estranged wife Lisa and her lover Cianci Lalamond, Lisa Toney finds herself facing some tough questioning from law enforcement.
Well, Lisa became a suspect almost immediately because we knew that this fraud activity was going on. And they also knew about the voicemail messages. The Chicago police, they started putting two and two together.
They took her in. She was held for a substantial period of time. The police decided to break her. She became very upset.
While Lisa's taking the heat for her husband's murder, Cianci has already moved on with a woman he met online.
Lisa eventually found out she wasn't the only woman for Cianci. She was one in a long line of women who had been duped and had been conned. Cianci was such a manipulator, such a womanizer.
And even though Lisa's been left holding the bag, she's still not ready to turn on her man. 2 days into her questioning by police, Lisa continues to maintain her innocence, insisting that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder.
She agreed to take a polygraph test, and she failed. And that made the investigators more focused on her involvement in the case.
Detectives decide to turn up the heat and share with her the grisly details of Marcus's death.
They started showing her crime scene pictures. She became very upset.
But she never acknowledged that she was involved.
Instead, Lisa points the finger at her lover.
Lisa did tell the detectives she was seeing another man, but at the same time, she didn't provide his name, and she even gave the wrong phone number. She was protecting him this entire time.
A few hours later, police release Lisa in the hopes that she'll lead them to more evidence. They suspect it's only a matter of time before her partner in crime reaches out. And sure enough, after 3 months on the run, Cianci calls Lisa.
She talked to Cianci at some point, and we got that number within hours. We tracked down the address for the tower was beeping off. That was coming from this woman's house in Hollywood.
Authorities started doing surveillance on the house. They saw a man that had Cianci's build, zeroed in on him. They took him into custody, and that's when he revealed, yes, I am Cianci Lalamond.
Realizing he's backed into a corner, Cianci is more than willing to turn on Lisa to save his own skin.
In order to avoid the death penalty, he agreed to cooperate in the investigation. And according to Cianci, she wanted him dead, and she was part of the fraudulent act.
Marcus was killed as a result of that. He lost his life that day because he opened the box and the bomb exploded and killed him.
A month after his death, based on the strength of Cianci's testimony, Lisa is arrested and charged with credit card fraud and the murder of her husband, Marcus. But at trial, Lisa claims that she was just as much a victim as her husband.
She was fatally attracted to him, but as to his criminal activities, she had no knowledge nor participated in the homicide of her husband.
Lisa has never acknowledged that she was involved, although the evidence, in my opinion, is overwhelming. We actually had witnesses that testified about how she helped with the fraudulent part. And every significant event in this bombing, she was talking to Cianci on her cell phone. That from purchasing components to when it was being built to its delivery.
Lisa Toney is found guilty of fraud and conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. For his part in the crime, Cianci Lalamond is sentenced to life in prison.
Cianci was the mastermind into the means of causing the murder, but Lisa was clearly the motive. He will never get out of prison.
Lisa is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The biting, sub-zero winds of a brutal Chicago December in 1999 did not just freeze the waters of Lake Michigan. They seemed to solidify a dark, impenetrable terror that would wrap its icy fingers around the heart of the city for nearly 3 decades. It was the absolute cusp of the millennium, a time of roaring celebrations, neon countdowns, and the collective euphoria of a new era, but inside a majestic, 3-story brownstone mansion in the historic, wealthy enclave of Gold Coast, a horrifying, silent execution was being meticulously carried out behind velvet curtains. 24-year-old heiress and classical prodigy Clara Lindstrom was found brutally strangled in her private music studio, slumped lifelessly over the ivory keys of her grand piano, a single, pristine white rose placed delicately in her frozen lap, its petals untouched by blood. The crime scene was an eerie, pristine nightmare that completely paralyzed the first responding officers. There was absolutely no forced entry, no shattered window glass, no missing family jewels, and not a single fingerprint left on the polished mahogany doors. The sheer, calculated cleanliness of the murder pointed directly to someone who moved through the high-security mansion like a trusted phantom, someone who understood the intricate layout of the estate and knew exactly how to bypass the state-of-the-art security alarms that kept the rest of the world out. Sirens wailed through the blinding blizzard that night, their crimson lights flashing against the stone facade, but the snow swept away every trace of the killer's exit, leaving behind a chilling urban mystery that would instantly morph into the most agonizing Chicago cold case of the modern era. Paranoia gripped the elite circles of the city like a vice as rumors exploded that a highly sophisticated, invisible predator was hunting the heirs of Chicago's wealthiest dynasties, selecting his targets with surgical precision and dissolving into the winter fog before the smoke could clear. For 27 long years, that silent music room remained a sealed capsule of grief, a monument to systemic forensic failure, while the official investigation stalled, grew bitterly cold, and was eventually buried under the crushing weight of newer, louder tragedies. But time is an unpredictable beast, and secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out, waiting for the ultimate betrayal to shatter a family's carefully engineered reality all over again. Tonight, the 27-year silence is violently broken, the ancient folders are ripped from the dark basement archives, and a sudden, earth-shattering arrest completely rewrites the history of a crime that Chicago could never forget, proving that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones sitting right across from you at the dinner table. The exclusive neighborhood of the Gold Coast in 1999 was a fortress of privilege, a labyrinth of historic limestone mansions, private security details, and high society galas where family reputations were guarded more fiercely than the crown jewels. When Clara Lindstrom dissolved into that elite, heavily guarded landscape, the illusion of safety within the city's upper crust was instantly incinerated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of mutual suspicion and whispered accusations. Elite homicide detectives systematically canvassed every adjacent property, interviewing high-profile neighbors, elite private security guards, domestic staff workers, and prominent socialites, searching desperately for a single pair of eyes that had tracked an intruder through the blinding snowstorm. But the extensive canvassing yielded a frustrating, absolute zero. The overwhelming chaos of pre-millennium parties and heavy holiday traffic had created a perfect wall of noise and distraction that completely camouflaged the execution. Forensic teams combed through the music studio for weeks, applying primitive digital extraction tools to her personal landline records and searching for latent biological markers or stray fibers that might belong to an uninvited guest. Every tip that flooded the police hotline led to an immediate dead end. Every suspected stalker turned out to be a false alarm. Every shadow in the alleyway behind the mansion remained a phantom. The complete lack of physical evidence forced investigators to face a terrifying reality. They were dealing with someone who possessed internal access, someone who moved through the mansion without triggering a single defensive reaction from Clara or the family's guard dogs. Months bled into grueling, silent years, and the initial frenzied energy of the investigation slowly cooled into the agonizing stagnation of a frozen folder, leaving Clara's surviving relatives to drown in a perpetual purgatory of unspoken blame and mounting hostility. Her father, a prominent real estate tycoon, spent his remaining fortunes on international private intelligence firms, refused to touch a single object inside the music studio, and kept a continuous, desperate vigil by the telephone until his death, praying for a breakthrough that seemed increasingly impossible as the years marched relentlessly forward. The file grew thick with useless reports, dead-end leads, and heartbreaking letters from a community paralyzed by fear, before being boxed up, labeled, and buried in the basement archives of police headquarters. By the arrival of the mid-2010s, the Lindstrom murder had transitioned from an active investigation into a legendary, unresolvable mystery that defined the strict limitations of early digital-era forensics. The world outside changed dramatically. Technology leaped forward, data analytics evolved, and surveillance networks became ubiquitous, yet the evidence from 1999 remained locked in stasis, a static collection of old photographs and yellowed notes. Generation after generation of cold case investigators would occasionally pull the dusty box from the dark shelves, staring at Clara's smiling portrait, searching for the microscopic flaw in the original timeline that had allowed a monster to escape into the free air. Paranoia within the Gold Coast gradually faded into a distant, historical scar, but the trauma had permanently altered the security infrastructure of the city's elite, forcing the installation of high-definition camera grids and biometric locks throughout the historic estates. Clara's brother, Arthur Lindstrom, who had inherited the family's real estate empire and the massive brownstone mansion, became a prominent public advocate for cold case victims, funding specialized task forces and keeping his sister's memory alive through highly publicized charity galas. He consistently pressured the police department to apply newly developed forensic tools to the ancient physical evidence, presenting himself as a tireless crusader for justice who refused to let his sister's killer rest easy. But without a fresh lead, a weapon, or a definitive forensic match, the state's case remained an unassailable fortress of doubt, a tragic puzzle waiting for a catalyst that no one could have possibly predicted. The catalyst did not emerge from a laboratory breakthrough, a sudden DNA match, or a meticulously planned police raid, but from the sterile, hushed confines of a high-security safe deposit box opened after a tragic death in late 2025. An elderly housekeeper who had served the Lindstrom family for 40 years passed away, leaving behind a strict legal will that directed her attorney to hand over a sealed leather satchel to the Chicago Police Cold Case Unit only after her burial. Inside that satchel lay a diary from the winter of 1999, containing detailed, daily logs of the internal movements within the Lindstrom mansion that had never been shared with the original detectives out of pure, mortal terror. The housekeeper had written about a fierce, violent argument that had broken out inside the mansion just hours before Clara's murder, an intense, explosive clash over the family's multi-million-dollar inheritance and a secret recording Clara threatened to expose to the authorities. When the veteran cold case detective opened the faded pages, the handwritten text revealed a chilling, hyper-detailed timeline that completely shattered 27 years of investigative assumptions and sent shockwaves through the entire Chicago Police Department. The hidden diary entries were not vague, emotional rants. They were a chilling, precise record of familial betrayal that completely rewrote the history of the 1999 investigation, pointing the finger directly at the one person who had claimed to be the ultimate victim. The text detailed how Arthur Lindstrom had been facing catastrophic financial ruin due to massive, illegal offshore gambling debts that threatened to incinerate the family's real estate empire before he could inherit it. On the night of December 14, 1999, he had not been at an elite country club gala across town as his ironclad alibi had claimed. He had been seen slipping back into the mansion through the basement servant's entrance, his face masked in a cold, desperate rage. Clara had confronted him at her studio, refusing to sign over her portion of the estate and threatening to disinherit him entirely by presenting evidence of his fraud to their father the following morning. The banality of greed had fueled the confrontation, transforming a brilliant classical prodigy into a liability that needed to be permanently, violently erased from the ledger before the sun could rise over the city. With sickening, cold-blooded precision, the diary entries explained how Arthur had used his intimate knowledge of the mansion's blind spots to execute a perfect, low-profile execution that completely bypassed the primitive security layout of the late 90s. He had approached his sister while she was practicing at her piano, using his familiar presence to disarm her natural survival instincts for the critical seconds necessary to close the physical distance between them. In a fraction of a second, he had lunged forward with sudden, overwhelming violence, using his physical size to choke the life out of her before she could utter a single cry for help or launch a desperate struggle. He had then staged the scene with chilling artistic flair, placing the white rose in her lap to mimic the calling card of a mythical society predator, locked the studio door from the outside, and calmly walked out through the blizzard, using the heavy snow to delete his footprints and completely confuse the investigators who had swarmed the perimeter just 12 hours later. The revelation grew increasingly horrific as modern forensic technicians applied newly developed, ultra-sensitive MVAC wet vacuum DNA collection systems to the original white rose petals and the preserved silk scarf Clara had worn on the night of her death. For 27 years, traditional forensic swabbing had failed to extract a viable genetic profile from the delicate materials, but the modern technology managed to penetrate deep into the fabric matrix, pulling microscopic skin cell material that had been trapped for nearly 3 decades. The laboratory technicians worked through the night, processing the fragile genetic material through high-density sequencers and running a direct comparison against the modern biological profile of Arthur Lindstrom. The digital monitors quickly confirmed the housekeeper's written words, revealing an absolute, undeniable match. The biological signature trapped within the weave of the murder weapon belonged to the grieving brother with the mathematical certainty of 1 in 7.8 billion. The immediate fallout from the forensic match triggered a massive, high-intensity tactical mobilization in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, shattering the morning peace of an exclusive gated community with the roaring arrival of black federal vehicles and state police cruisers. A specialized unit of heavily armed officers descended upon Arthur Lindstrom's sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, executing a high-priority arrest warrant that instantly brought down a 27-year lie. Arthur is taken into custody in his plush home office, surrounded by the very charity awards and cold case advocacy plaques he had used as his ultimate psychological camouflage for nearly 3 decades. The news of his arrest sent an electric jolt of absolute disbelief and profound horror through the city of Chicago, dominating every major media network under the Dawn DAP, rapid-fire banner. Chicago 1999 cold case solved. Family crusader exposed as sister's killer. For the remaining members of the Lindstrom social circle and the legal architects who had watched the folder gather dust for a generation, the sudden, shocking resolution brought an overwhelming wave of emotional vertigo that completely upended their reality. At the televised press conference later that afternoon, the chief of homicide displayed side-by-side images of Clara's 1999 funeral and Arthur's modern booking photograph, exposing the terrifying dichotomy of an urban predator who had used his sister's tragic death to build an unassailable reputation as a public savior. The presentation shattered the city's remaining sense of safety, proving to a stunned public that no matter how deep a secret is buried behind wealth, privilege, and time, the modern weaponization of forensic genomics possesses an elemental, crushing force that can outlast the human heart. The psychological impact of the discovery completely transformed the community of the Gold Coast, forcing citizens to confront the terrifying reality that a systematic killer had lived, worked, and governed high society charities in their midst for 27 years without ever drawing a single glance from the law. The case underscored a dark, historical truth about familial violence, exposing how an offender could leverage extreme wealth, trusted access, and a highly sophisticated public relations campaign to camouflage a cold-blooded murder. As the heavy steel doors of the Cook County Jail slammed shut behind Arthur Lindstrom, the long, agonizing shadow of 1999 was officially, violently dispelled from the city. The silent music studio that had haunted a dynasty for a generation had finally yielded its ultimate, stomach-turning truth, leaving behind a permanent, sobering reminder that justice can be delayed by a lifetime, but the code of human life cannot be permanently erased by time, and the voices of the dead will eventually find a way to demand absolute accountability in the blinding light of day. The grand jury presentation initiated under an ironclad shield of secrecy, but the shocking details leaking from the federal courthouse continued to paralyze the public consciousness like a nonstop, 24-hour loop of historical horror. Prosecutors systematically laid out the timeline, using the housekeeper's hidden diary, the corporate bank records from 1999, and the mathematically indisputable DNA data to paint a picture of an apex predator who had spent his entire adult life playing the role of a grieving saint while holding the keys to his sister's tomb. Outside the granite walls, the permanent encampment of media trucks and citizens continued to swell to historic proportions, the entire nation watching the heavy glass doors for any sign of a final trial date that would permanently erase the freedom of the man who had outrun the law for a generation. Clara Lindstrom's music had been violently stopped in the freezing darkness of 1999, but 27 years later, the cold, unyielding mechanics of modern justice had finally forced the keys to play their final, devastating note of absolute retribution. The legal machinery of the state of Illinois moved with a sudden, crushing velocity that left Arthur Lindstrom's highly compensated defense team completely paralyzed, their standard constitutional delaying tactics rendered entirely obsolete by the sheer mass of the scientific evidence. In the high-security holding cell beneath the courthouse, the 72-year-old billionaire sat slumped against the concrete wall, his tailored suit wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, the mask of his aristocratic omnipotence completely shattered into nothingness. He was no longer the powerful real estate titan or the celebrated philanthropist. He was a trapped animal facing an unassailable mountain of forensic certainty that his money could not buy its way out of. The grand jury returned a swift, unanimous true bill of indictment for first-degree murder, ensuring that the trial of the century would proceed without a single corporate loophole to shield the ghost of his reputation from the blinding light of total public exposure. As the winter snow began to fall over the Chicago skyline once more, mimicking the exact atmospheric conditions of that fateful night in December 1999, a profound sense of historical finality settled over the Gold Coast brownstone. The heavy oak doors remained sealed, but the terrifying aura of mystery that had shrouded the property for 27 years had completely evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear reality of judicial triumph. For the cold case detectives who had dedicated their entire careers to chasing a phantom, the arrest was a historic validation of their unyielding persistence, a definitive proof that time possesses no shielding power when modern science decides to weaponize the truth against a monster. Clara Lindstrom's grand piano would never play another melody, but the legal record of her victory was permanently etched into the history of the city, leaving behind an enduring, chilling lesson that the most lethal predators are not the ones lurking in the dark alleyways, but the ones who share your blood and smile at your success while planning your execution. The mechanical hum of the digital forensic preservation units inside the Chicago Police Department's main laboratory vibrated through the sterile, fluorescent-lit air, filling the room with a heavy, clinical tension. For 27 years, the physical remnants of the Clara Lindstrom murder had been locked inside a standard, cardboard evidence box, labeled as a permanent cold case file, and buried deep within the climate-controlled vaults of the Cook County Basement Archives. To the casual observer, the faded plastic bags containing a dried, brittle white rose and a preserved silk scarf were nothing more than tragic relics of a bygone era, static symbols of a night when the city's elite security systems had utterly failed. But as the state-of-the-art MVAC wet vacuum extraction system was meticulously prepared by a specialized unit of molecular geneticists, the physical geometry of a multi-million-dollar familial deception began to systematically unravel. The technical mechanics required to execute this modern forensic extraction without destroying the fragile, nearly 3-decade-old biological material were incredibly complex, demanding a level of microscopic precision that was entirely science fiction in December 1999. Traditional forensic swabbing methods used at the turn of the millennium were only capable of collecting surface-level biological matter, completely missing the microscopic skin cells that became deeply embedded within the porous, woven matrix of high-end fabrics during a violent physical struggle. The MVAC system, operating as a high-velocity, sterile fluid extraction device, utilized a specialized pressurized spray to gently dislodge the trapped cellular material from the deep fibers of Clara's silk scarf before immediately vacuuming the solution into a sterile collection chamber. Every square centimeter of the fabric was systematically scanned under intense ultraviolet light arrays, mapping out the precise physical touchpoints where the killer's hands had clamped down to extinguish the brilliant life of the classical prodigy. Outside the secure perimeter of the police headquarters, behind the double-layered rings of heavy yellow crime scene tape that blocked off the media access corridors, a massive sea of news trucks, legal analysts, and stunned Gold Coast residents braved the biting Chicago wind. The sudden, explosive revelation that Arthur Lindstrom, the billionaire real estate titan, the celebrated philanthropist, and the self-proclaimed public crusader for cold case victims, had been arrested for the brutal execution of his own sister completely paralyzed the public consciousness. The narrative dominating every local and national television broadcast had violently shifted under the Don Dapp, rapid-fire banner. The aristocratic predator, Chicago 1999 cold case exploded. The case was no longer a historical mystery that belonged to the archives of the pre-millennium era. It had transformed into an active, bleeding systemic crisis that forced high society to re-examine its most prominent leaders through a lens of pure, unadulterated horror. Inside the secure digital forensics laboratory, the low, rhythmic whirring of the high-density genetic sequencers finally ceased, replaced by the sudden, sharp chime of a computer terminal indicating a complete data match. The lead forensic genomics expert, working in tandem with the multi-agency task force, stared at the high-definition monitor as the digital graphs locked into an indisputable, mirroring alignment. The biological signature pulled from the deep weave of the murder weapon did not merely resemble the defendant's family tree, it matched Arthur Lindstrom's modern, legally obtained reference profile with an absolute mathematical certainty of 1 in 7.8 billion. The data proved that while the blizzard of 1999 had successfully deleted his physical footprints from the limestone steps of the mansion, it could not protect his microscopic biological signature from the unyielding, generational advance of modern molecular science. As the scientific link was solidified in the laboratory, a secondary, equally intense investigative offensive was unfolding inside the secure, heavily guarded interrogation suite at the Cook County Courthouse, where elite cold case detectives were systematically dissecting the private financial ledger of the Lindstrom real estate empire from the late 1990s. The long-hidden diaries of the family's deceased housekeeper had provided the initial, devastating roadmap, but it was the digital reconstruction of offshore banking records, hidden wire transfers, and fraudulent corporate loan applications that provided the ultimate, undeniable motive for the execution. Financial analysts uncovered a massive, clandestine network of illegal gambling debts and failed international real estate speculations that had placed Arthur Lindstrom on the absolute brink of total financial annihilation just days before Clara was murdered. The financial data revealed a chillingly calculated, cold-blooded timeline of desperation that completely destroyed the ironclad alibi Arthur had presented to investigators 27 years prior. In December 1999, Arthur had claimed to be attending an elite charity gala across town at the exact hour his sister was killed, a claim that was backed up by prominent socialites who remembered seeing him briefly during the crowded, chaotic event. But the digital reconstruction of cellular tower pings, private black car service logs, and internal mansion security bypass codes proved that he had slipped away from the gala during the height of the pre-millennium distractions, utilizing his personal vehicle to navigate the snow-slicked streets back to the Gold Coast mansion. He had entered through the basement servant's entrance, using his intimate knowledge of the home's blind spots to execute the crime, before calmly returning to the country club gala to ensure his presence was documented by the high society crowd. The psychological profile that emerged from the task force's deep dive was that of an incredibly disciplined, compartmentalized sociopath, a man who was capable of executing his own sister for financial preservation, and then utilizing her tragic death as a personal public relations platform to elevate his social status for nearly 3 decades. By funding cold case task forces, hosting massive charity galas in Clara's name, and publicly demanding justice from successive police chiefs, Arthur had managed to position himself as the ultimate victim, completely insulated from suspicion by a wall of manufactured grief and extreme wealth. He had integrated his dark secrets so deeply into his ordinary, aristocratic routine that he had truly believed the law could never touch him, unaware that the silent, preserved white rose in Clara's lap would eventually act as the ultimate forensic anchor to pull his empire of lies into the blinding light of public execution. Back outside the courthouse steps, Julian Vance, a veteran investigative journalist who had followed the Lindstrom mystery since the first sirens wailed in 1999, stood before a wall of cameras, his face a portrait of profound weariness, but unyielding, investigative triumph. He detailed for the watching public how the extreme wealth and political influence of the Lindstrom dynasty had effectively paralyzed the original homicide investigation, creating a systemic barrier that traditional police work simply could not penetrate at the turn of the millennium. The money didn't buy safety forever, Vance declared, his voice carrying an immense weight of authority that echoed through the crowded city streets. It bought 27 years of stolen luxury, 27 years of public praise, but it could not buy its way out of the math of human inheritance. The code of human life is spoken, the stone fortress has been breached, and the man who spent a lifetime hiding behind his sister's ghost is finally going to face the judgment of a jury of his peers. The digital clock on the wall of the Cook County State's Attorney's high-security war room ticked past 3 a.m., its steady, green glow illuminating a room that had become the clinical epicenter of a historic societal collapse. For 27 years, Arthur Lindstrom had slept soundly within the gilded borders of the Gold Coast, his multi-billion-dollar empire shielded by a dense wall of political connections, high society charity checks, and a carefully manufactured image of deep, generational grief. But inside the sterile, paper-choked confines of the prosecution's headquarters, that shield was being systematically ground to dust beneath the weight of absolute, unassailable financial informatics. The master investigative ledger, now officially indexed under the people of the state of Illinois versus Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom, had ceased to be an old homicide investigation. It had transformed into a clinical, digital autopsy of a family dynasty built on a foundation of pure, cold-blooded asset elimination. The morning session of the task force's deep-dive financial extraction initiated with the arrival of a massive, heavily encrypted data dump from the Swiss Federal Department of Justice and Police. Under international forensic accounting treaties that had newly evolved by 2026, the state had successfully pierced the historic, double-blind anonymity of offshore shell corporations registered in Zurich and the Cayman Islands during the absolute winter of 1999. Analysts sat in focused silence as the data streams began to populate the room's high-definition projection monitors, converting a chaotic maze of ancient bank routings into a dawn-dap, rapid-fire timeline of ultimate desperation. The charts revealed that while Arthur Lindstrom was publicly weeping at his sister's funeral, his private, digital fingers were frantically shifting millions of dollars out of Clara's trust accounts to satisfy a terrifying network of underground, high-stakes sports gambling syndicates operating out of Macau and Las Vegas. The chief forensic accountant took the podium, his voice flat, analytical, and completely devoid of emotion as he walked the state prosecutors through the mathematical choreography of the murder motive. "Look at the absolute convergence of the dates," he stated, using a digital stylus to highlight a sharp, cascading drop in the Lindstrom corporate cash reserves during the final week of November 1999. Arthur wasn't just facing a minor cash flow crunch. He had systematically leveraged the family's primary real estate holdings as collateral to cover massive, unauthorized short positions on the international market. By December 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. He needed exactly $12.5 million in liquid capital before the banking grid opened on December 15th, or the entire Lindstrom name would be exposed as a fraudulent house of cards. The only asset capable of generating that level of instant mitigation was Clara's independent, unencumbered trust fund, an asset she refused to sign over to him. The financial blueprints mapped perfectly over the handwritten entries of the housekeeper's hidden diary, creating an ironclad, multidimensional trap that left the defense table completely dead in the water. The data proved that on the afternoon of the murder, Clara had initiated a secure, outbound telephone call to the family's primary estate attorneys, requesting an emergency meeting for the following morning to formally strip Arthur of his executive power over her financial interests. The banality of the greed was sickening. Clara had been executed not by a mythical, shadow-dwelling society stalker, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his sister as a line-item liability that needed to be permanently deleted from the ledger before the financial markets could open to expose his ruin. While the financial task force was locking down the absolute motive, a secondary, highly intense forensic offensive was unfolding inside the state police microtrace analysis laboratory. Technicians were systematically utilizing advanced laser-induced fluorescence imaging to examine the original 30-story mahogany doors and security keypads of the Gold Coast mansion, which had been permanently removed and preserved within climate-controlled storage facilities. At the turn of the millennium, primitive fingerprint powder had failed to detect any usable friction ridges on the polished surfaces, but the modern 2026 laser arrays managed to penetrate deep beneath the layers of historic cleaning waxes, isolating a microscopic sequence of low-density skin cell oils that mapped perfectly to Arthur Lindstrom's right index finger and palm. The physical data proved with absolute, clinical certainty that someone had manually bypassed the estate's state-of-the-art security grid from the interior servants' entrance at exactly 12:42 a.m. on the night of the murder. The security logs showed that the individual utilized a highly restricted, master override code that was only known to 3 living people: Clara, her deceased father, and Arthur. The defense's long-standing narrative that a highly sophisticated international cat burglar had scaled the limestone walls and bypassed the infrared sensors without a single alarm trigger was completely demolished by the physical reality of the internal system data. The shadow that moved through the dark hallways of the mansion that night didn't need to break in. He carried the key, he knew the code, and he moved with the absolute comfort of an owner who truly believed his status placed him completely above the reach of the law. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Cook County Courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a non-stop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high-society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive police chiefs while holding the keys to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the war room through the long night hours, his eyes fixed on the digital display of Clara's final, silent piano notes, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, judicial reckoning. The empty music room that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and financial science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The freezing Chicago wind howled through the canyons of LaSalle Street as the legal machinery of the state of Illinois prepared to mount its most devastating systemic assault against Arthur Lindstrom. It was now mid-2026, and the upcoming pretrial hearings had transformed the Cook County Criminal Courts building into a high-stakes fortress of media and state security. The prosecution team, flanked by digital analytics experts and elite homicide investigators, spent the midnight hours transforming Grand Jury Room 2 into a digital war theater. Behind them, massive high-definition monitors glowed with an absolute, dawn-dap, rapid-fire sequence of banking transcripts, microcellular maps, and molecular structural breakdowns that stripped away the last remaining illusions of the defendant's innocence. Arthur Lindstrom sat confined in a high-security holding block beneath the courthouse, his multi-billion-dollar legal team frantically scrambling to construct a constitutional defense against a mountain of truth that grew taller with every tick of the clock. The morning session initiated with a high-impact presentation by Dr. Marcus Thorne, a pioneer in the field of forensic digital engineering and spatial reconstruction. Dr. Thorne walked to the witness podium with a clinical, detached precision that instantly commanded the absolute attention of the presiding judge and the gathered legal correspondents. Behind him, the digital projection screens illuminated the darkened courtroom with a three-dimensional, pixel-perfect recreation of the Gold Coast mansion as it existed on December 14, 1999. The software systematically integrated historical weather data from the National Weather Service, the structural blueprints of the limestone estate, and the internal tracking data pulled from the mansion's primitive security mainframe. With a flat, commanding authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, Dr. Thorne demonstrated the physical impossibility of Arthur Lindstrom's historical alibi. The defense had maintained for 27 years that Arthur was physically present at the Standard Country Club Gala across town during the critical 90-minute window when his sister was choked to death over her grand piano. But Dr. Thorne's spatial animation mapped out a chillingly precise alternative choreography. The program tracked the digital footprint of Arthur's corporate security transponder, which had been automatically logged by an automated tollway reader along Lakeshore Drive at exactly 12:14 a.m. on the night of the murder, a route that led directly away from the country club and straight toward the Gold Coast. The digital infrastructure of 1999 was primitive, but it was not non-existent, Dr. Thorne declared, his voice echoing clearly through the silent, packed gallery. The defendant operated under the assumption that because his name was scrubbed from the physical guest logs of the gala, his movements across the city were invisible. But the automated tollway network captured his vehicle's unique electronic signature heading north toward the mansion, and exactly 42 minutes later, the internal security logs of the Lindstrom estate documented a manual bypass of the basement servant's entrance using Arthur's private, master security pin. He did not need to force his way through the snow. He moved through the house with the absolute, undisputed access of an executioner who knew exactly which camera feeds to deactivate. The physical evidence presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when the prosecution team introduced the physical contents of the deceased housekeeper's leather satchel into the official record. The original, handwritten diary from December 1999 sat beneath a thick pane of high-impact ballistic glass on the evidence cart, its faded ink pages serving as a devastating, multi-generational voice from the grave. The prosecution's lead investigator read aloud a sequence of daily logs from the week leading up to the murder, detailing a terrifying pattern of hidden domestic terror, corporate blackmail, and financial desperation that had been completely hidden from the original homicide detectives out of pure, mortal fear. The diary entries exposed a series of intense, violent confrontations between Arthur and Clara over the secret recording Clara had captured on her studio dictaphone, a recording that documented Arthur admitting to a massive, illegal corporate embezzlement scheme that threatened to destroy the family's entire real estate empire. According to the housekeeper's logs, Clara had given her brother a strict, 24-hour ultimatum to turn himself into federal regulators before she presented the digital files to their father. The banality of the greed was sickening. Clara had been choked to death not by an anonymous society stalker or a transient cat burglar, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his own sister as an existential threat to his freedom and his multi-million-dollar inheritance. The weight of the technical data and physical testimony completely locked the legal vice around the defense, leaving Arthur Lindstrom's high-profile attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver during their cross-examination phase. They attempted to launch a desperate line of questioning regarding the chain of custody of the housekeeper's diary, suggesting that the document had been altered or manufactured by disgruntled former employees seeking to sabotage the family dynasty. But the prosecution counterattacked immediately, introducing an array of forensic ink dating reports and handwriting analyses that solidified the absolute authenticity of the diary, effectively cutting off the defense's last remaining exit route and rendering their arguments entirely obsolete before the eyes of the court. Outside the heavy granite walls of the courthouse, The public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live updates under the Dawn DAP, rapid-fire banner. The Sovereign Predator, Chicago 1999 cold case solved. The viral true crime broadcasts and digital analytical streams had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding the absolute immunity that extreme wealth and political influence had bought during the late 20th century. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the keys to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the gallery through the long hours of the pre-trial hearings, his eyes fixed on the empty glass witness box, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, judicial reckoning. The empty music room that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The bitter chill of the high-security courtroom matched the freezing temperatures locked outside the stone walls of the Cook County Criminal Courts building as the afternoon session of the pretrial hearings shifted into a phase of pure, biological confrontation. The defense table, once an unassailable fortress of corporate wealth and elite legal strategy, was visibly trembling under the weight of the upcoming scientific presentation. The multi-agency task force, operating under the master rubric of the Chicago 1999 cold case solved, was no longer rely on 27-year-old circumstantial theories or handwritten diary entries from long-deceased staff members. They were preparing to deliver the ultimate, definitive blow to Arthur Lindstrom's freedom through the absolute, clinical application of modern forensic genomics and cellular matrix reconstruction. The state's lead molecular geneticist, Dr. Catherine Vance, took the witness stand with a detached, clinical precision that instantly commanded the attention of the court. She carried a thick, white digital binder containing the comprehensive, multispectral DNA sequencing analysis pulled from the deep fibers of the preserved silk scarf Clara Lindstrom had worn on the night of her execution. Behind her, the massive digital projection screen illuminated the darkened room, displaying a highly detailed, 3-dimensional molecular map of the fabric's weave, overlaid with contrasting bands of bright crimson and electric blue light that mapped out the precise touchpoints of a violent physical struggle. With a flat, authoritative tone that cut through the defensive legal posture of the courtroom, Dr. Vance walked the court through the mathematical certainty of the modern MVAC wet vacuum extraction results. She demonstrated how the advanced system had bypassed the surface-level limitations of primitive late 90s forensic swabbing, penetrating deep into the internal core of the silk matrix to isolate 42 distinct, low-density skin cell clusters that had been permanently trapped for nearly 3 decades. The original investigators were limited by the tools of their era, searching only for visible blood or high-volume sweat markers, Dr. Vance stated, her voice echoing clearly through the silent gallery. But modern forensic genomics operates on a cellular level. What we are looking at on this screen is not a random environmental transfer or a trick of coincidental handling. This is an intense, localized sequence of epithelials left behind at the exact moment a high-intensity strangulation was carried out. The scientific presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when Dr. Vance activated the comparative genetic profile overlay, displaying the exact matching sequences of short tandem repeats and single nucleotide polymorphisms pulled from both the scarf and Arthur Lindstrom's modern reference sample. The digital bars locked into a flawless, mirroring alignment, destroying any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared regarding potential laboratory contamination or familial DNA cross-reactivity. The mathematical probability of this specific biological profile belonging to any other living human being on the face of this earth is exactly 1 in 7.8 billion, Dr. Vance declared, her gaze locking firmly onto the lead defense attorney. This is Arthur Lindstrom's permanent, indelible biological signature, left behind at the center of a murder weapon and preserved by time until the world developed the science necessary to decode his crime. The weight of the genomics data completely paralyzed the defense table, leaving Arthur's high-profile attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver during their brief, desperate cross-examination phase. They attempted to shift their focus toward a technical challenge regarding the private laboratory's digital storage protocols, suggesting a potential chain of custody vulnerability that should retroactively taint the physical fruit of the investigation. But the prosecution counterattacked immediately, introducing an array of state-validated forensic tracking logs that solidified the absolute purity of the evidence pipeline, effectively cutting off the defense's last remaining constitutional exit route and rendering their arguments entirely obsolete before the eyes of the court. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the courtroom was plunged into a heavy, emotional silence as lead prosecutor David Vance rose to deliver the state's final pretrial summation, a Don-Dap, rapid-fire sequence of proof that felt like the slow, crushing closing of a vice around the defendant's life. Vance did not read from notes. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the presentation floor, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the collective gravity of an entire city that had spent 27 years searching the shadows for an answer. He pointed a heavy, trembling finger directly across the room at the quiet, elderly billionaire sitting in the tailored charcoal suit. For 27 years, Arthur Lindstrom believed his wealth made him smarter than the law, smarter than the science, and smarter than the very community he systematically exploited and betrayed, Vance declared, his words cutting through the stillness like a hammer cracking stone. He hid his malice behind a smile, behind philanthropic donations, and behind the stolen memory of his brilliant sister. But the truth is an elemental force, Your Honor. It does not forget, it does not decay, and it does not stay buried forever beneath a fortress of privilege. The silk scarf is spoken, the ivory keys have been vindicated, and the ghosts of his past are standing right behind him demanding their final, absolute measure of justice. The defense team sat in a state of frozen, collective exhaustion as the judge retired to her chambers to draft the final trial orders, a visceral realization settling over the courtroom that the legal shield of the Lindstrom dynasty had been permanently shattered into nothingness. Outside the heavy granite walls of the courthouse, the permanent media encampment had swollen to an unprecedented, historic magnitude, a sea of flashing satellite lights, television cameras, and silent crowds of citizens who stood huddled together under a canopy of heavy winter coats, waiting for the final trial date that would permanently rewrite the history of modern American justice. Michael Vance stood prominently at the front of the gates, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding resolve, his eyes fixed firmly on the courthouse doors as the legal machinery of the state prepared to permanently lock away the monster who had spent a lifetime building an empire of luxury on the foundation of a silent execution in the dark. The dense, frozen atmosphere inside Grand Jury Room 2 of the Cook County Criminal Courts building remained completely unyielding as the pretrial hearings entered their second grueling week. Outside, the early summer Chicago rain of June 2026 pelted against the reinforced glass windows, but inside, the focus was trained entirely on a cold case from 1999 that was rapidly thawing under the relentless flame of modern forensic informatics. The defense table, which had initially projected an aura of unassailable corporate invincibility, now looked like a command center under a state of permanent siege. Arthur Lindstrom sat motionless in his customized high-back chair, his wrinkled hands clasped loosely in his lap, his aristocratic posture slowly compressing under the weight of an escalating, multi-layered digital and physical dragnet. The morning session initiated with a high-stakes, rapid-fire presentation by Special Agent Evelyn Vance of the FBI's Cyberforensics Division, who had been permanently attached to the Municipal Task Force. Agent Vance carried a secure, government encrypted solid-state drive containing the complete, restored digital architecture of the Lindstrom real estate conglomerate's internal server files from the final quarter of the 20th century. Behind her, the massive multi-panel presentation wall illuminated the darkened room, displaying a complex, interlocking network of red and white data streams that mapped out a hidden landscape of corporate espionage, systemic asset stripping, and catastrophic financial fraud. With a flat, authoritative precision that instantly severed any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared, Agent Vance walked the court through the chronological anatomy of Arthur Lindstrom's desperation. She demonstrated how the defendant had systematically exploited his executive access to the family's primary commercial development funds to finance an aggressive, highly illicit offshore speculation scheme involving high-risk digital currency prototypes and unregulated maritime ports in Southeast Asia. When the international markets experienced a sharp, unpredicted correction in early December 1999, Arthur's entire financial structure collapsed like a house of cards, exposing him to an immediate, multi-million-dollar deficit that would have triggered an automatic federal investigation and permanent disinheritance by his father. The financial records we have recovered from the legacy servers do not show a routine corporate misstep, Agent Vance stated, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the legal murmurs of the gallery. They document a highly disciplined, desperate scramble for absolute survival. By Monday, December 13, 1999, the offshore banking syndicates had issued an absolute 24-hour ultimatum to liquidate his positions or face immediate exposure. The only liquid asset within the entire family portfolio that possessed the exact valuation necessary to stop the financial execution was Clara Lindstrom's independent, unencumbered musical trust fund. What the original investigators treated as a tragic, random assault by an anonymous society stalker was, in absolute reality, a highly calculated, cold-blooded corporate liquidation executed to preserve an inheritance. The digital presentation shifted from the macroeconomic fraud to the intimate, microforensic tracking of the family mansion's internal telecommunication networks on the night of the murder. Technicians had utilized advanced, multispectral signal reconstruction to isolate a sequence of deleted digital data packets from the estate's primitive late 90s private branch exchange telephone switchboard. The restored data logs revealed a terrifying, unrecorded detail. At exactly 11:14 p.m. on December 14th, less than 2 hours before her death, Clara Lindstrom had initiated an emergency, secure data transmission to her personal attorney's home office, attempting to route a digitized audio file containing an explicit recording of Arthur admitting to the corporate embezzlement. The discovery of this digital trace completely locked the vice around the defense, providing a devastating, mathematically precise timeline that mapped perfectly over the handwritten entries of the housekeeper's hidden diary. The data proved that Arthur's sudden return to the Gold Coast mansion from the country club gala was not a casual or coincidental movement. He had received an automated digital alert on his encrypted pager indicating that Clara was actively accessing the corporate mainframe from her private music studio. The banality of the corporate surveillance was stomach-turning. Clara had been hunted and executed by her own brother not because of a sudden burst of familial rage, but because she had successfully compiled the digital evidence required to destroy his life of luxury. To solidify this timeline beyond a shadow of a single scientific doubt, the prosecution team called senior trace analyst Dr. Liam Hayes to the witness stand. Dr. Hayes was responsible for the physical examination of the original digital dictaphone that had been recovered from a false bottom inside Clara's piano bench during the secondary task force sweep in early 2026. Under the high-powered magnification of a scanning electron microscope, Dr. Hayes displayed the internal circuit board of the recording device, pointing out a series of microscopic, high-intensity fracture lines along the primary magnetic recording head that indicated it had been violently forcibly extracted and crushed by a heavy mechanical object. Using advanced magnetic force microscopy, the trace unit had managed to read the residual, subsurface magnetic domains left behind on the fragmented internal tape particles that had survived the destruction. The audio reconstruction, though heavily distorted by decades of mechanical compression and physical decay, filled the silent courtroom with a low, gravelly, unmistakable voice that caused the color to completely drain from Arthur Lindstrom's face. The recording captured a brief, chaotic segment of the final confrontation inside the music studio. Arthur's voice, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of his public philanthropic warmth, demanding the immediate surrender of the master data discs, followed by Clara's definitive, echoing refusal just seconds before the audio feed cut into static. The weight of the restored audio and digital tracking data completely paralyzed the defense table, reducing Arthur's high-priced legal team to a state of absolute silence as the afternoon session drew to its close. They attempted to launch a minor constitutional motion to suppress the magnetic microscopy results, claiming that the physical destruction of the tape rendered any modern digital extraction inherently speculative and unscientific. But the presiding judge denied the motion immediately from the bench, ruling that the science behind the subsurface magnetic reconstruction was fully validated under modern federal evidentiary standards, effectively sealing the historical record and leaving the defendant completely exposed to the upcoming jury selection phase. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Cook County Courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live digital analytical streams under the Don Dapp, rapid-fire banner. The Digital Trap, Chicago 1999 Cold Case Closed. The viral true crime broadcasts and continuous live feeds had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding the absolute immunity that extreme wealth and political influence had bought during the late 20th century. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the key to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, his eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The empty music room that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Chicago's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The scorching midsummer sun of late June 2026 beat down relentlessly on the heavy limestone facade of the Cook County Criminal Courts building, but inside the secure, climate-controlled confines of Courtroom 404, the air was chilled to an icy, absolute freeze. The transition from the high-stakes pre-trial technical hearings into the formal commencement of the trial phase marked a profound, historic shift in the legal history of Chicago. For 27 years, the elite social circles of the Gold Coast had whispered about the phantom that had violently silenced Clara Lindstrom, treating her murder as a mythical, tragic urban legend that defied the boundaries of modern policing. But on this morning, the illusion of safety, prestige, and permanent billionaire immunity was completely stripped away as the state prepared to seat the final members of the jury panel, turning the judicial theater into an unyielding, Don Dapp engine of absolute forensic accountability. The master trial docket, officially registered under the Administrative Code the State of Illinois versus Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom, stood as an unprecedented landmark in modern criminal jurisprudence. This was not a routine trial designed to litigate an emotional confession or debate a collection of circumstantial witness sightings. It had evolved into a clinical, technologically weaponized tribunal, a multi-generational prosecution of an aristocratic sociopath whose entire adult life had been a masterclass in psychological camouflage and corporate image manipulation. The lead prosecutor, David Vance, stood at the podium with a calm, predatory focus, his dark tailored suit matching the solemn gravity of the binders stacked across the presentation tables. Behind him, the digital monitors hummed with a low electronic frequency, ready to project a devastating array of molecular, financial, and digital certainties that would systematically grind Arthur Lindstrom's 27-year lie into absolute dust. The morning session initiated with the definitive presentation of the state's opening statement, a Dawn-Dap, rapid-fire narrative that immediately pinned the newly seated jurors to their high-backed leather chairs. Vance did not look at a notepad or rely on standard legal rhetoric. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the presentation floor, his voice carrying a flat, commanding resonance that instantly cut through the dense corporate atmosphere of the courtroom. He traced the timeline of December 14, 1999, with surgical precision, mapping out the cold reality of familial execution that had been carried out beneath the gilded ceilings of the Gold Coast mansion while the rest of the city was distracted by the roaring celebrations of the pre-millennium countdown. We are not here to ask this panel to solve a mystery, or to sift through a collection of vague memories and old police hunches, Vance stated, his eyes locking directly onto the faces of the jurors. We are here to present a mathematical equation of absolute guilt, written in the permanent, indelible language of modern forensic science and offshore financial informatics. Arthur Lindstrom believed that because he possessed billions of dollars, because he controlled a vast real estate empire, and because he spent 3 decades funding cold case charities, he had successfully outrun the reach of Illinois justice. He believed that the blizzard of 1999 had permanently deleted his footprints from the steps of his sister's tomb. But the science does not compromise, it does not recognize the passage of time, and it does not bow to the political influence of the elite. The blood of his sister has spoken through the fibers of her scarf, and the code of his own life has trapped him in a vice from which his wealth cannot buy an exit. The state's opening salvo moved systematically from the macro concept of the murder motive to the physical reality of the evidence, sitting beneath the laboratory lights. One by one, senior forensic trace analysts and cybercrime experts were called forward to introduce the foundational components of the state's master archive into the trial record. The focus shifted to the physical presence of the deceased housekeeper's leather satchel, which was placed prominently on the central evidence card, its faded, water-damaged contents serving as a chilling, multi-generational voice from the grave. The prosecution read a sequence of daily log entries from the winter of 1999, detailing a terrifying pattern of hidden domestic terror, corporate blackmail, and financial desperation that had been completely concealed from the original homicide detectives out of pure, mortal fear. The presentation grew increasingly intense as the prosecution introduced the comprehensive financial tracking data newly unsealed by Swiss and Cayman Islands regulatory authorities. Analysts demonstrated how the defendant had systematically leveraged the family's primary development funds as collateral to cover massive, unauthorized short positions on the international market, creating a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar deficit that threatened to trigger an automatic federal investigation and permanent disinheritance by his father. The financial data revealed a chillingly calculated, cold-blooded timeline of desperation that completely destroyed the alibi Arthur had presented to investigators 27 years prior. By December 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. Arthur needed exactly $12.5 million before the banking grid opened the following morning, and the only liquid asset capable of generating that level of instant mitigation was Clara's independent, unencumbered musical trust fund, an asset she had definitively refused to sign over to him. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Cook County Courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a nonstop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the key to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, his eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The empty music room that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Chicago's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The rhythmic tapping of the court stenographer's machine was the only sound cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of courtroom 404 as the prosecution's financial task force prepared to deliver its most critical blow. It was late June 2026, and the trial of the state of Illinois versus Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom had entered its most clinical phase. The corporate armor that had shielded the 72-year-old billionaire for nearly 3 decades was no longer merely being scratched. It was being systematically dismantled, piece by digital piece, before a jury that sat in frozen, absolute concentration. The state was no longer relying on old police notes or 27-year-old circumstantial theories. They were introducing a devastating, dawn-dap stream of forensic informatics that transformed a cold-blooded familial execution into a mathematically indisputable certainty. Lead forensic accountant Evelyn Vance took the witness stand, carrying an encrypted state-issued hard drive containing the completely restored digital architecture of the Lindstrom real estate conglomerate's legacy banking records from the winter of 1999. Behind her, the massive multi-panel presentation wall illuminated the darkened courtroom, displaying a complex, interlocking matrix of international bank routings, wire transfers, and margin call notices. The visual data converted a chaotic maze of offshore corporate maneuvers into a direct, linear timeline of ultimate desperation, mapping out the precise financial choreography that had led Arthur Lindstrom to cross the distance between a high-society country club gala and his sister's private music studio on the night of December 14, 1999. With a flat, clinical authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, Accountant Vance walked the jury through the macroeconomic reality of the defendant's collapse. She demonstrated how Arthur had systematically leveraged the family's core commercial holdings as secret collateral to fund an aggressive, highly illicit offshore speculation loop involving unregulated maritime ports in Southeast Asia. When the international markets experienced a sharp, unpredicted contraction in early December 1999, Arthur's entire financial empire collapsed like a house of cards, exposing him to an immediate $12.5 million deficit that would have triggered an automatic federal fraud investigation and permanent disinheritance by his tyrannical father the very next morning. The financial records we have recovered from the Zurich and Cayman Islands legacy servers do not document a routine corporate misstep or a simple cash flow crunch, Accountant Vance stated, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the legal murmurs of the gallery. They document a highly disciplined, desperate scramble for absolute survival. By the afternoon of December 14th, the margin calls were closing in like a physical vice. The defendant had less than 12 hours to secure the liquidation of a multi-million-dollar asset before the banking grid opened on December 15th. The only unencumbered asset within the entire family portfolio that possessed that exact valuation was Clara Lindstrom's independent musical trust fund, an asset she had definitively and repeatedly refused to sign over to him. The financial blueprints mapped perfectly over the handwritten entries of the housekeeper's hidden diary, creating an ironclad, multi-dimensional trap that completely eliminated the defense's ability to launch a plausible counter-narrative. The data proved that at exactly 4:12 p.m. on the afternoon of the murder, Clara had initiated a secure, recorded telephone call to the family's primary estate attorneys, requesting an emergency board meeting for the following morning to formally strip Arthur of his executive power over her financial interests and expose his fraud to their father. The banality of the greed was stomach-turning. Clara had been hunted and choked to death over her grand piano not because of a sudden burst of sibling rage, but by a modern corporate executive who viewed his own sister as a liability that needed to be permanently deleted from the ledger to preserve his lifestyle of stolen luxury. The presentation grew increasingly intense as the prosecution shifted its focus from the macroeconomic motive to the micro-trace physical evidence that had been pulled from the crime scene itself. A senior trace analyst took the stand, displaying a series of high-resolution digital scans that utilized advanced laser-induced fluorescence imaging to examine the original 30-story mahogany doors and security keypads of the Gold Coast mansion. At the turn of the millennium, primitive fingerprint powder had utterly failed to detect any usable friction ridges on the polished surfaces, but the modern 2026 laser arrays managed to penetrate deep beneath the layers of historic cleaning waxes, isolating a microscopic sequence of low-density skin cell oils that mapped perfectly to Arthur Lindstrom's right index finger and palm. The physical data proved with absolute, clinical certainty that someone had manually bypassed the estate's state-of-the-art security grid from the interior servants' entrance at exactly 12:42 a.m. on the night of the murder. The security logs showed that the individual utilized a highly restricted, master override code that was only known to 3 living people: Clara, her deceased father, and Arthur. The defense's long-standing narrative that a highly sophisticated international cat burglar had scaled the limestone walls and bypassed the infrared sensors without a single alarm trigger was completely demolished by the physical reality of the internal system data. The shadow that moved through the dark hallways of the mansion that night didn't need to break in. He carried the key, he knew the code, and he moved with the absolute comfort of an owner who truly believed his status placed him completely above the reach of the law. Outside the heavy granite walls of the Cook County Courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, true crime analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal shock at the unfolding revelation. The media landscape was a nonstop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens sat a high society community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the key to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who stood as a permanent, unyielding anchor on the courthouse steps every single morning, the rapid-fire accumulation of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional vertigo but complete, unshakable resolve. He sat in the front row of the gallery through the long, grueling hours of the technical presentations, his eyes fixed firmly on the empty space behind the defense table, realizing that the long journey which had initiated in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, historical conclusion. The empty music room that had stood as a monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades was finally being illuminated by the blinding light of modern molecular and digital science, proving to a watching world that while a killer can use extreme wealth, political shields, and time to build an empire of lies, the truth possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The gears of modern justice were grinding forward without a single pause, preparing to hand the file over to 12 citizens who would determine the final, permanent fate of Chicago's most sophisticated aristocratic predator. The sterile, high-voltage hum of the court's digital display network seemed to grow louder as Courtroom 404 descended into its most technically ruthless phase of testimony. It was the afternoon of June 28, 2026, and the trial of the state of Illinois versus Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom had stripped away the last remaining layers of high society pretense, leaving only the cold, unyielding mechanics of modern molecular biology to dictate the final narrative of the 1999 Gold Coast execution. The defense team, which had spent nearly 3 decades relying on an ironclad wall of political influence, expensive public relations management, and primitive forensic limitations, sat in absolute, frozen isolation as the prosecution called its pinnacle scientific witness to the stand. Dr. Catherine Vance, the director of molecular genomics at the Illinois State Forensic Institute, stepped up to the witness podium with a slow, deliberate precision that signaled the absolute end of speculative legal maneuvering. She carried a single, heavily encrypted digital ledger containing the multispectral DNA sequencing matrices that had been pulled directly from the preserved fabric of the silk scarf found wrapped around Clara Lindstrom's throat. Behind her, the massive digital projection screens flickered to life, displaying a high-definition, 3-dimensional topological map of the scarf's silk fibers. The display was overlaid with a DAP, rapid-fire sequence of high-contrast genetic bar graphs, casting a pale, clinical blue light across the pale, drawn faces of the 12 jurors. With a flat, commanding authority that left the defense table completely paralyzed, Dr. Vance initiated her breakdown of the modern MVAC wet vacuum recovery process. She detailed how the specialized forensic apparatus had utilized a pressurized, sterile solution to penetrate deep beneath the surface layers of the silk matrix, dislodging ancient, trapped epithelial skin cells that traditional cotton swabs had completely failed to capture at the turn of the millennium. The digital map systematically traced 42 separate, low-density cellular clusters that had been embedded into the porous weave of the fabric during the intense, violent friction of a high-intensity strangulation. The original forensic teams in December 1999 were looking for visible biological fluids, blood, heavy saliva, or high-volume sweat stains, which were completely absent from this pristine crime scene, Dr. Vance declared, her voice carrying a sharp, clinical resonance that cut through the stifling courtroom air like a scalpel. But modern molecular forensics does not require a visible stain to establish an absolute physical connection. What we have successfully extracted from the deep weave of this scarf is the permanent, microscopic cellular residue of the killer's hands. When an individual applies the immense physical force required to fracture a human hyoid bone and extinguish a life, their skin cells are violently sheared off and ground into the fabric matrix, effectively creating an indelible, biological blueprint of the assault. The scientific presentation reached its absolute, suffocating peak when Dr. Vance activated the comparative genomic profile overlay on the central projection screens. The digital monitors displayed a side-by-side alignment of the short tandem repeat configurations and single nucleotide polymorphisms pulled from the scarf fibers alongside the modern, legally mandated reference profile obtained from Arthur Lindstrom following his arrest. One by one, the 24 distinct genetic markers locked into a flawless, mirroring alignment, destroying any remaining theoretical arguments the defense had prepared regarding potential environmental contamination, historical laboratory mishandling, or random familial DNA cross-reactivity. The mathematical reality of this scientific match is absolute and entirely unassailable, Dr. Vance stated, turning her gaze directly toward the jury box. The probability of this specific genetic profile belonging to any other living human being on the face of this planet is exactly 1 in 7.8 billion. This data does not present a statistical suggestion or a vague circumstantial association. It is a definitive, molecular identification. The microscopic cells trapped within this murder weapon for 27 years belong to the defendant, Arthur Lindstrom, proving with mathematical certainty that his hands were the ultimate instrument of his sister's destruction. The sheer weight of the genomic mapping completely paralyzed the defense table, reducing Arthur's high-priced legal architects to a state of absolute, visible defeat. Their pre-planned cross-examination strategy, which had relied on trying to aggressively confuse the jury with technical jargon and procedural obfuscation, was instantly rendered entirely obsolete by the unyielding precision of the molecular math. When given the opportunity to question the witness, the lead defense attorney could only offer a few brief, halting queries regarding the exact temperature controls of the evidence archive, which Dr. Vance effortlessly dismantled by producing a complete, digitally verified log of the climate-controlled storage vault spanning back to January 2000. Outside the heavy granite architecture of the Cook County Courthouse, the public paralyzation had reached a state of unprecedented national magnitude, with major news networks running continuous, live digital analytical streams under the Dawn DAP banner. The molecular execution, Arthur Lindstrom's genetic code trapped. The viral true crime broadcasts and continuous investigative specials had completely transformed the case from a localized legal proceeding into a profound cultural reckoning regarding corporate security protocols and the historical immunity that extreme wealth had bought during the late 20th century. The realization that a systematic killer had navigated the highest echelons of Chicago society for 4 decades, building an empire of public philanthropy on the foundation of a cold-blooded familial execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city. For Julian Vance, who sat silently in the front row of the gallery, his face a mask of absolute physical exhaustion but complete, unshakable peace, the relentless Dawn DAP delivery of forensic proof brought a profound wave of emotional release that transcended the clinical parameters of a legal victory. The long, agonizing journey that had initiated with the wail of sirens in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999 was drawing down to its definitive, historical destination, proving to a watching world that while a predator can use thousands of tons of corporate wealth, political shields, and time to build a fortress of secrecy, the modern weaponization of forensic genomics possesses an elemental, crushing force that will eventually crack the foundation and demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The grand jury room sat in a state of frozen concentration as the state prepared to arrest its master case, leaving the final fate of Chicago's most sophisticated aristocratic predator permanently in the hands of 12 citizens who had looked directly into the face of absolute truth. The low, structural hum of courtroom 404's climate control system was the only sound left to fill the suffocating silence as the final gavel of the defense's cross-examination phase echoed off the walnut-paneled walls. It was the afternoon of June 28, 2026, and the trial of the state of Illinois versus Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom had reached its ultimate, definitive breaking point. The corporate mythology, the decades of high society philanthropic posturing, and the multi-million-dollar legal shields that had insulated the 72-year-old real estate tycoon for 27 long years were entirely gone, ground to absolute dust beneath the Dawn DAP, rapid-fire presentation of molecular math, and digital forensic informatics. The defense table sat in a state of frozen, collective paralysis, their arguments completely exhausted, their alternative theories rendered utterly obsolete by the unyielding precision of the state's master biological archive. Lead prosecutor David Vance slowly rose from his seat at the state's table, adjusting the cuffs of his dark charcoal suit before stepping out onto the center of the courtroom floor. He carried no notes, no presentation clickers, and no legal binders. His movements were slow, deliberate, and carried the immense, crushing weight of a multi-agency task force that had spent nearly 3 decades chasing a phantom through the highest echelons of Chicago's elite. He walked along the perimeter of the jury box, his eyes locking directly onto the faces of the 12 citizens who had sat through weeks of technical genomic mapping and historical financial audits, their expressions drawn tight with a profound sense of historical responsibility. When Vance spoke, his voice did not carry the standard theatrical volume of a traditional closing argument. It dropped to a flat, clinical, gravelly whisper that seemed to vacuum the remaining oxygen directly out of the room. For 27 years, a silent executioner walked the streets of the Gold Coast. Vance initiated, his hand gesturing vaguely toward the heavy glass windows that overlooked the sweltering Chicago skyline. For 27 years, the elite institutions of this city hosted galas, signed charity checks, and shook hands with a man who claimed to be a crusader for the forgotten, a public savior who wept openly for the tragic, unsolved loss of his brilliant sister, Clara Lindstrom. But as you look across this courtroom today, the illusion of that public saint is entirely gone. The science has stripped away the tailored suits, the corporate titles, and the political alliances, leaving us face to face with the raw, calculated reality of a predator who viewed his own family as nothing more than a line-item liability to be permanently liquidated in the dark. Vance turned sharply on his heel, his finger pointing with absolute, unyielding violence directly across the room at Arthur Lindstrom, who sat slumped forward in his leather chair, his silver hair disheveled, the mask of his aristocratic omnipotence completely shattered into nothingness. The defense has spent days trying to convince you that this case is too old, that the evidence is too fragile, and that the timeline is too obscured by the fog of the pre-millennium era to find absolute certainty, Vance declared, his voice rising in a steady, dawn-dap crescendo that vibrated through the studio-quality recording arrays of the courtroom. They want you to believe that a mythical, international society cat burglar scaled the limestone walls of that mansion, bypassed an advanced infrared security grid without triggering a single alarm, and executed a classical prodigy over her grand piano for absolutely no financial gain. But the data we have entered into this permanent record does not trade in myths, it does not rely on old police hunches, and it does not compromise with extreme wealth. Behind the prosecutor, the massive digital projection screens flickered to life for the final time, displaying a high-contrast, side-by-side alignment of the housekeeper's handwritten diary from December 1999 and the modern MVAC molecular sequencing charts. The visual intersection was devastatingly absolute. The exact hour Arthur's private security transponder was logged by an automated tollway reader on Lake Shore Drive mapped perfectly over the internal system bypass codes used to deactivate the basement servant's entrance. The math of human inheritance does not lie, Vance stated, his voice dropping back to a low, rhythmic cadence that pinned the jurors to their seats. The digital legacy servers from Zurich and the Cayman Islands have documented the absolute motive, a $12.5 million corporate deficit that was closing in on the defendant like a physical vice. Clara held the key to his financial execution. She possessed the digital dictaphone recording of his fraud, and she gave him a strict 24-hour ultimatum to surrender to federal regulators. He didn't cross the city that night to visit his sister. He crossed the city to eliminate a witness and secure a multi-billion-dollar empire of stolen luxury. The prosecution's closing narrative reached its absolute, suffocating peak when Vance walked over to the climate-controlled evidence cart, pointing directly at the sealed biohazard bag containing the original silk scarf. The defense wants you to believe that the microscopic cells pulled from this weapon could have been transferred by a casual hug, an environmental cross-contamination, or a trick of historical storage, Vance argued, his gaze unblinking as he stared down the lead defense counsel. But Dr. Vance's genomic mapping has proved that these epithelial clusters were ground deep into the internal core of the silk matrix by a physical force that exceeded hundreds of pounds of pressure, a force that fractured a human hyoid bone and stopped a brilliant life mid-melody. The probability of those cells belonging to anyone else on this earth is 1 in 7.8 billion. That is not a statistical anomaly. That is Arthur Lindstrom's permanent, indelible biological signature, trapped within the weapon of his crime for 27 years until the world developed the molecular science required to decode his monstrosity. Vance paused, letting the absolute mathematical certainty of the genomic data settle over the room like a heavy block of ice. He walked back to the center of the presentation floor, his hands resting flat against the wooden railing of the jury box, his voice carrying a final, deep wave of emotional gravity that cut through the clinical atmosphere of the court. Clara Lindstrom's music was violently, permanently silenced in the sub-zero darkness of December 1999, Vance whispered, his eyes scanning the faces of the 12 citizens who held the final, permanent fate of the Lindstrom dynasty in their hands. But the code of human life possesses an elemental, crushing force that outlasts the human heart, outlasts the stone walls of a Gold Coast mansion, and outlasts the lifetime of a billionaire predator. The white rose has yielded its truth, the ivory keys have been vindicated, and the voices of the dead have finally broken through 27 years of silence to demand their account. The state has rested its case. The math is absolute. The timeline is locked. We ask you to return the only verdict that honors the unyielding march of human justice. Find the defendant, Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom, guilty of first-degree murder. As Vance stepped back to the state's table, A profound, historic stillness descended upon courtroom 404, the heavy oak doors closing behind the jury panel as they retired to initiate their deliberations. Outside the granite architecture of the Cook County Criminal Courts building, the public paralyzation had reached an unprecedented, historic magnitude. Thousands of media trucks, true crime digital analysts, and ordinary citizens stood huddled together along the boiling pavement of LaSalle Street, their eyes fixed firmly on the massive digital video walls that projected live updates under the Don Dapp banner. The jury retires. Chicago 1999 cold case awaits final verdict. Julian Vance stood prominently at the center of the media gates, his face a portrait of profound physical exhaustion but absolute, unshakable peace, his ears tuned to the distant, rhythmic hum of a city that was finally about to witness the absolute execution of justice for a classical prodigy whose song had finally found its way home. The oppressive summer heat of late June 2026 seemed to vanish entirely inside the packed, stone-cold gallery of courtroom 404, replaced by an absolute, electric stillness that signaled the final, historic convergence of a 27-year judicial hunt. The clock on the mahogany wall ticked with a heavy, mechanical cadence, each second driving a deeper wedge into the collapsing legacy of the Lindstrom dynasty. For 3 agonizing weeks, the multi-agency task force operating under the banner of Operation Millennium Reckoning had delivered a Don Dapp, nonstop barrage of genomic certainty, cyberforensic server restorations, and indisputable trace informatics. Now, the heavy oak doors leading to the jury deliberation chambers slowly clicked open, and the 12 citizens who held the final, unassailable truth of Chicago's most notorious cold case walked back into the room with pale, solemn faces and unblinking eyes. Arthur Lindstrom sat rigidly at the defense table, his multi-million-dollar legal architects flanking him like a hollow Praetorian guard whose shields had been utterly ground to dust by the power of molecular math. The 72-year-old former real estate titan looked remarkably fragile under the harsh, clinical glare of the courtroom floodlights, his tailored charcoal suit hanging loosely from his slumped shoulders, his manicured hands trembling slightly as he stared blankly at the empty space before him. The elite psychological camouflage he had meticulously maintained for nearly 3 decades, the public philanthropy, the millions of dollars donated to cold case charities, the staged tears at annual memorial galas for his sister Clara, had been completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, calculated reality of a corporate predator exposed to the blinding light of public execution. The judge commanded absolute silence from the gallery, her gavel resting untouched on the bench as the court clerk stepped forward to receive the official verdict forms from the jury foreperson. The rustle of the heavy, state-stamped paper echoed through the breathless room like a sudden fracture in stone. The clerk, a veteran of the Cook County system whose voice carried the flat, clinical resonance of an unyielding administrative machine, adjusted her glasses and turned directly toward the digital recording arrays to enter the historic decree into the permanent archives of the state of Illinois. On the master count of first-degree murder, encompassing the intentional, premeditated strangulation of Clara Lindstrom on the night of December 14, 1999, inside the Gold Coast estate, how does this jury find? The clerk intoned, the words hanging in the frozen air like an unexploded charge. The foreperson, a high school statistics teacher who had listened to every hour of Dr. Catherine Vance's genomic mapping data with focused intensity, looked directly across the floor, his eyes locking onto the defendant with absolute, chilling finality. We, the jury, find the defendant, Arthur Montgomery Lindstrom, guilty of first-degree murder. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the gallery, instantly cut short by the immediate, imposing presence of state court officers who surrounded the defense table. Arthur Lindstrom did not scream, he did not weep, and he did not launch into a frantic denial. He simply closed his eyes, a low, defeated sigh escaping his lips as 27 years of stolen luxury, corporate dominance, and calculated deception collapsed into absolute nothingness. The mathematical reality of the MVAC molecular sequencing, the 1 in 7.8 billion certainty that his own epithelial cells were ground deep into the internal matrix of the silk murder weapon, had systematically closed every constitutional loophole his wealth could buy, trapping him permanently within the vice of his own biological code. Outside the heavy granite architecture of the courthouse, the public paralyzation erupted into a state of unprecedented national frenzy as the live video feeds transmitted the verdict to millions of waiting screens under the Don Dap rapid-fire banner. Guilty. Chicago 1999 cold case solved. Family crusader sentenced to life. The viral true crime broadcasts and digital analytical streams that had tracked the trial like an urban thriller achieved their ultimate, historic peak, transforming the case from a localized legal victory into a sweeping cultural validation for cold case victims across the world. The realization that extreme wealth, political shields, and time possessed absolutely no defensive power when modern science weaponized the truth against a monster's past shattered the historical illusions of the city's elite, sending shockwaves through the corporate boardrooms of the Gold Coast. For Julian Vance, who had sat silently in the front row of the gallery since the first gavel fell, the delivery of the guilty verdict brought a profound, overwhelming wave of emotional release that seemed to lift a generational weight off his chest. The frantic, obsessive decades he had spent as an independent investigative journalist, tracking tollway transponder layouts, analyzing deleted corporate server packets, and documenting the family's hidden financial ruins, had finally reached their definitive destination. He looked down at the small, framed photograph of Clara he held tightly in his palm, her brilliant smile frozen in the classic elegance of 1999, realizing that her music had finally broken through thousands of tons of societal indifference and billionaire obstruction to claim its final, absolute measure of justice. As the state guard stepped forward to clamp heavy steel handcuffs around Arthur Lindstrom's wrists, stripping away the final remnants of his aristocratic authority, lead prosecutor David Vance turned to his team with a look of quiet, exhausted triumph. The legal ledger for the Gold Coast execution was completely clear. The housekeeper's hidden diary had been vindicated from the grave, and the ivory keys of the grand piano that had stood as a silent monument to forensic failure for nearly 3 decades were finally washed clean of a brother's malice. The long shadow of 1999 was officially, permanently dispelled from the streets of Chicago, leaving behind an enduring, chilling lesson for the modern world. You can build an empire on a secret. You can hide behind uniforms, titles, and time, but human identity is permanent. The code of life does not decay, and the truth will eventually shatter the foundation to demand absolute accountability in the light of day. The echoing slam of the heavy security doors behind Arthur Lindstrom did not merely mark the physical removal of a convicted billionaire from the sight of the public. It signaled the permanent, systemic collapse of an entire era of high society secrecy. It was late afternoon on June 28, 2026, and the immediate aftermath of the historic verdict in Courtroom 404 had plunged the Cook County Criminal Courts building into a state of intense, clinical transformation. The multi-agency task force that had executed Operation Millennium Reckoning did not pause to celebrate the absolute validation of their work. They immediately began the meticulous, high-stakes process of converting the trial's massive forensic database into a permanent, unassailable archive of judicial truth, ensuring that no future corporate appeals or historical revisionism could ever obscure the absolute certainty of Lindstrom's monstrosity. Inside the prosecution's secure digital war room, the atmosphere remained completely clinical, focused, and charged with the residual energy of a multi-generational hunt. Technicians systematically uploaded the multispectral DNA sequencing matrices, the three-dimensional spatial reconstructions of the Gold Coast mansion, and the restored digital architecture of the legacy Zurich banking servers into the federal cold case registry. The master file, now permanently stamped with the seal of a first-degree murder conviction, was no longer a collection of tragic, unsolved theories. It had evolved into a foundational master template, a clinical blueprint that would be utilized by international law enforcement academies to train future generations of homicide detectives on how to aggressively dismantle the highly sophisticated, compartmentalized camouflage of aristocratic predators. Outside the heavy granite walls of the courthouse, the public spectacle had reached a magnitude that completely paralyzed the surrounding downtown grid, drawing thousands of media crews, legal analysts, and ordinary citizens who felt a profound, personal stake in the outcome of the investigation. The media landscape was a non-stop, 24-hour echo chamber of sensational headlines, but behind the flashing television screens and viral true crime podcasts sat a community trying to reckon with a deep, systemic trauma. The realization that Arthur Lindstrom had spent 27 years serving as the highly publicized face of cold case charities, smiling for photographs with successive mayors while holding the key to his sister's execution, completely incinerated the public's remaining trust in the elite institutions of the city, driving intense demands for immediate structural audits of historical asset transfers across the country. For Julian Vance, who had spent his entire adult life carrying the crushing weight of his sister's missing status and the unyielding pursuit of the truth, the arrival of this final judicial finality brought a profound wave of emotional exhaustion that transcended the simple, clinical concept of legal victory. He stood before the massive bank of microphones on the courthouse steps, his face a portrait of profound weariness but unyielding resolve, his dark tailored suit shielded from the blistering Chicago sun by the towering shadow of the columns. He did not read from a prepared statement. His voice carried a flat, commanding resonance that instantly silenced the shouting media pack, declaring to the world that the time for hiding was officially over. The monster who had spent a lifetime building an empire of luxury on the foundation of a silent execution in the dark was finally brought into the light, and the code of Clara Lindstrom had finally found its way home. The long-term systemic ripples of the conviction began to aggressively reshape the legal and financial landscapes of the state of Illinois as the summer weeks advanced. Under the newly established Lindstrom Forensic Accountability Act, passed by the state legislature in direct response to the structural failures exposed during the trial, the legal protections historically afforded to multi-generational trust funds and private estate corporations were permanently altered. The groundbreaking statute mandated that any asset protection vehicle could be instantly pierced by the state if advanced molecular or digital tracing established probable cause that the funds were actively utilized to conceal, facilitate, or profit from a violent criminal enterprise. The law effectively weaponized the financial informatics developed during Operation Millennium Reckoning, ensuring that future corporate operators could no longer use the complexity of offshore shell companies to insulate their personal crimes from the reach of forensic science. Simultaneously, the physical geometry of the Gold Coast mansion where Clara's voice had been violently silenced underwent a profound, symbolic purification. Under a court-ordered asset forfeiture decree, the historic three-story brownstone estate was stripped from the Lindstrom corporate portfolio and turned over to an independent municipal foundation dedicated to preserving the legacy of classical music prodigies and funding modern forensic genomics research. The Silent Music Studio, which had sat embedded within the limestone fortress for 27 years as a sealed monument to familial betrayal, was systematically dismantled by structural engineers, its original mahogany doors and piano components transferred to the State Forensic Museum to serve as an enduring, physical lesson on the absolute persistence of microtrace biological material. Inside the behavioral analysis units of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the complete psychological profile of Arthur Lindstrom was formally integrated into the advanced training curricula for future criminal profilers, forcing a total retirement of the primitive, disorganized transient theories that had dominated 20th century investigative models. Specialized seminars systematically dissected how Lindstrom had successfully weaponized the ordinary, mundane routines of corporate philanthropy and cold case advocacy to build an unassailable shield of public trust. The case study proved with absolute, mathematical precision that the most dangerous predators do not operate from the margins of society. They live within the very core of its elite institutions, utilizing the banality of high society connections and massive charitable donations to completely blind local authorities to their predatory history. As the gold and amber light of a late summer evening slowly settled over the expansive, modern skyline of Chicago, painting the concrete overpasses and glistening waters of Lake Michigan in deep hues of violet, the long, terrifying phantom of the 1999 cold case was officially, permanently erased from the public path. The soil of the city was clean, the legal books were sealed, the phantoms of the iron box had been brought home, and the 6 young women whose voices had broken through the stone across decades of Texas and Illinois history were finally, definitively resting in the light. The baseline of human life had won its multi-generational war against the silence, proving to a watching world that time, wealth, and thousands of tons of structural deception possess absolutely no shielding power when modern forensic science decides to weaponize the truth against a killer's ghost.